Today, we're diving into a topic that affects millions of people but often flies under the radar: lactose intolerance. Let me paint you a picture. Maybe this sounds familiar. You're out to brunch, you order your usual, a cappuccino with oat milk because you're trying to do better, and an omelet that comes with cheese. The coffee goes down fine, and the omelet is delicious, but by late afternoon, you feel like a balloon. You're gassy, crampy, and uncomfortable. You start wondering, did you get some gluten in there? Was it the greens? Was it broccoli in there? Was it something you ate yesterday? Now imagine you're someone like Rachel. Rachel's one of my actual clients, and her story is one I hear over and over again in different forms. She thought she was eating a clean diet, cutting out gluten, going organic, even avoiding sugar. But no matter what she did, her bloating stuck around. When we started unpacking her symptoms, one detail stood out to me. She always felt worse after eating out, especially after things like creamy sauces, cheesy omelets, or those healthy protein bars with hidden whey protein. And what Rachel didn't realize was that it wasn't the fat or the fiber or the gluten, it was lactose. And here's the thing: lactose intolerance is incredibly common, but it doesn't always present the way people expect. It's not just explosive bathroom trips after milkshakes. Sometimes it's more subtle, like feeling puffy, foggy, or just off after certain meals. And because symptoms can be delayed, most people don't make the connection. In today's episode, we're going to break down exactly what lactose intolerance is, how to figure out if you're sensitive to it, and most importantly, how to build a diet that works with your body instead of against it. So, whether you've been dairy free for years or just starting to wonder if milk might be messing with your gut, this episode is for you. So, first, let's talk about what is lactose intolerance, and let's break down exactly what it is and why it's so commonly misunderstood. Lactose is the natural sugar found in milk, and to digest it properly, your body needs an enzyme called lactase, which is produced in the small intestine. When you don't make enough lactase, the lactose doesn't get broken down, and instead it travels undigested. Here it is, a sugar molecule traveling undigested into your colon, where your gut bacteria feed on it. They have heyday and they produce gas, water, and short chain fatty acids that cause bloating, cramping, and loose stools. So, the part that may surprise a lot of people is that it's completely normal for lactase production to decline with age. Most babies produce plenty of lactase to digest breast milk, but in many people, that enzyme production slows down after childhood. This is known as lactase non-persistence, and it's especially common in certain populations like those of East Asian, African, Hispanic, and indigenous descent. And while it gets labeled as an intolerance, this isn't an allergy or a disease. It's just a mismatch between the food and your enzyme availability. The severity of symptoms depends on how much lactose you eat, how much lactase you produce, and even the state of your gut microbiome, which we'll touch on in a little bit. One reason this topic gets so confusing is that people often hear lactose intolerance and assume that all dairy is off limits. But that's not true at all. In fact, many dairy products are naturally very low in lactose or virtually lactose free. That's things like hard cheeses like cheddar, Parmesan, and Swiss. These cheeses go through an aging process that breaks down most of the lactose. And because they're made from solid curds of milk, not the lactose rich whey, then what you're left with is mostly fat and protein. And you can hear my excitement about this because that's often really good news for people who cut out all dairy. They're really missing cheese because, let's be honest, when you cut out dairy, you're not missing drinking a glass of milk. Usually you're missing that cheese. So this is excellent news that actually most cheeses are virtually lactose free, but the softer cheeses do have a significant amount of lactose. So it's just those hard cheeses, which is a lot of cheeses that are super low in lactose. And butter also falls into this category. Butter is mostly pure milk fat with only trace amounts of lactose. And yet, these are the foods many people avoid first while still eating things like yogurt or light ice cream, which often contain more lactose than people realize. So, in this episode, we're not just talking about what to cut out, we're talking about what you can keep in because understanding the difference between lactose and dairy is a game changer. So let's talk about symptoms because this is where people often get confused or misled. Lactose intolerance doesn't always look dramatic. Yes, some people get the classic symptoms, the bloating, the cramping, urgent trips to the bathroom, or even diarrhea soon after eating something creamy. But for many people, the symptoms are subtle or delayed, things like gas, fatigue, a general feeling of heaviness in the gut, or even nausea that hits a few hours later and gets chalked up to stress or overeating. And the kicker is symptoms don't always show up right away. Sometimes it's not until hours later or even the next morning that you feel the effects. And it makes it harder to connect the dots, especially when you're eating healthy foods like Greek yogurt and thinking there's no way this could be causing a problem. So, how do you figure out if dairy is an issue? The first step is usually tracking. I recommend keeping a simple food and symptom journal, writing down what you eat, how you feel afterwards. This can be a surprising, powerful tool. And if you start to notice that your symptoms creep up after meals with milk, yogurt, creamy dressings, or certain protein bars or shakes, that's a clue. If you want more clarity, there are a couple tests that can help. The hydrogen breath test is the most common. With this, you drink a liquid containing lactose and then you breathe into a device every 15 to 20 minutes. If your body can't digest the lactose, the bacteria in your gut ferment it, producing hydrogen, which gets exhaled through your breath. There's also genetic testing, which can tell you whether you carry the gene that allows you to keep lactase into adulthood. But keep in mind, this test won't catch secondary lactose intolerance, and that's a kind that shows up because of another gut issue like SIBO, IBS, or even celiac disease. So that's why in clinical practice, I often suggest starting with diet trials and symptom tracking first. And you might be surprised how quickly symptoms calm down when you pull the right foods out, or how clear it becomes which ones are causing the trouble. All right, so next, let's talk about what foods are actually safe to eat and how to figure out your personal level of tolerance without cutting out more than you need to. So, now that you know what lactose intolerance is, how it shows up, let's think about the things you can still enjoy because it's probably more than you think. This is where I see a lot of unnecessary restriction. A doctor or friend says just cut out all dairy. I hear this a lot with GI doctors, though, if they're good enough doctors. I just love when doctors talk about nutrition in general. So if they're even talking about nutrition, but they have 3 minutes with you, so they might oversimplify and say, cut out dairy. Really, they mean lactose, but people will start eliminating everything, even foods that may not be causing a problem. And that's frustrating, it's not sustainable, and it's usually not necessary. The truth is, not all dairy contains the same amount of lactose either. So, a lot of foods that people love, as we mentioned earlier, the cheese and butter, are actually very low in lactose or virtually lactose free. So, a lot of people are shocked when I tell them, hey, you can probably tolerate cheese better than you can tolerate milk. But it makes sense when you understand how cheese is made. Most of the lactose-rich whey is drained off during production, and the remaining curds are fermented and aged, which further breaks down any remaining lactose. And then, as we mentioned with butter, butter, because it's mostly milk fat, only contains trace amounts of lactose. And so, somebody who's extremely sensitive might still react to butter, but for most people with lactose intolerance, butter is usually just fine. And it's a much better option than, say, processed margarine or dairy-free spreads that are full of additives. So if you needed permission to have some butter, there it is for you from a dietitian. And if you want to be on the extra healthy side, you can go with grass-fed butter. So it has a little more omega-3 content, which are healthy fats. And then, of course, just use it in moderation. So next, let's talk about yogurt because this one does trip people up. Yogurt has a health halo. It's full of probiotics, it's high in protein, and it's often one of the last dairy products people hold on to when they're switching to a whole foods diet. And while it's true that the live cultures in yogurt help break down some of the lactose, it still contains a pretty decent amount, especially if you're eating it daily or in large portions. Greek yogurt is slightly lower in lactose, but it's definitely not lactose free. And that's why it's so important to test out your own personal tolerance and not assume that something is safe just because it's marketed as healthy. And of course, there are always lactose-free dairy products, things like lactose-free milk, lactate milk, lactose-free cottage cheese, which there's a brand called Green Valley, lactose-free cottage cheese. These are real dairy. They come from cows. They're just treated with the lactase enzyme so that you don't react. And these can be great options if you want to keep dairy in your routine. Maybe you want the calcium, you want the nutrients that are in dairy, you want the protein, but you don't want to have the symptoms. Don't let a lactose intolerance diagnosis make you feel like you're stuck eating boring food or avoiding everything you love. The goal here is not to restrict, it's to get specific. The details matter, and that way you can eat more of the things you like without discomfort. One of the biggest concerns people have when they cut out dairy is, am I going to miss out on important nutrients? So let's talk about that because that's a really valid question. Because dairy is a major source of calcium, vitamin D, and protein for a lot of people. But the good news is, with a little planning, you can absolutely meet your needs without relying on traditional dairy products. So let's say you do have an actual issue with dairy, so there's a difference between lactose intolerance and, say, a dairy allergy or a dairy sensitivity, where you may be reacting to the proteins, the actual proteins in dairy, not the sugar in dairy. So if you actually do need to go with plant-based options for whatever reason, dairy sensitivities are pretty common, then here are some ways you can still get your nutrients. So let's start with calcium. Most people do associate calcium with milk, and yes, dairy is one of the richest sources, but it's not the only one. You can also get calcium from leafy greens like bok choy, kale, and collard greens, from canned salmon or sardines with bones. Those tiny little bones are where the calcium is, from chia seeds, tofu, almonds, and white beans, or from fortified foods like calcium-enriched almond milk or oat milk. And remember that hard cheese, if you can have dairy and you just are super lactose intolerant, hard cheese like Parmesan or cheddar is a really good source of calcium because you get a large amount in just a small portion. So next up, going back to plant-based options, let's talk about vitamin D. And this one is a bit trickier because they're really, in general, plant-based or not, there are just not a lot of natural food sources of vitamin D. We're supposed to make it by being in the sun, actually. So fatty fish like salmon and mackerel do have some vitamin D. Egg yolks have a small amount, but most people get it from fortified foods or from sunlight. And depending on where you live and how much time you actually spend outside with your skin exposed, a supplement might just be the best way to maintain optimal levels. And vitamin D is important because it plays a key role in calcium absorption. So these two nutrients go hand in hand, especially when it comes to bone health. Now, the next one is protein. Many people use yogurt or milk or whey protein shakes to hit their protein goals. There are plenty of other ways to do it, and some of my favorites are lean meats like chicken, turkey, or beef, fish and seafood, legumes, tofu and tempeh, or dairy-free protein powders like pea protein or rice protein blends. Brands like Orgain or Garden of Life have great options for those that you can find pretty easily. So the bottom line is that cutting back on dairy does not mean you have to sacrifice nutrition. It just means being a little more intentional and making sure your swaps are nutrient dense and balanced. So let's talk about real life for a second, because cutting out or cutting back lactose isn't just about what's in your fridge. It's about how you shop, how you order at restaurants, and how you plan to travel. And if you're not prepared, that's when accidental lactose exposure can sneak in and sabotage your progress. So let's start with grocery shopping. Reading labels becomes second nature over time, but at first, it helps to know what you're looking for. Here are a few common ingredients that usually contain lactose. This is things like seeing the word milk solids or dry milk powder on an ingredient list or whey protein concentrate. Whey protein isolate is usually fine. Curds, casein, and caseinate, and anything that's labeled cream sauce, cheese flavor, or creamy dressing. Lactose can also show up in less obvious places like frozen meals, deli meats, snack bars, or even in some medications and supplements. I know, right? So I do always recommend keeping a cheat sheet on your phone of some of these words to look out for until you get the hang of it, and just checking the ingredient list on everything for a while until you get a sense for what has lactose and what doesn't. Now, when it comes to eating out, the trick is asking the right questions. So, most restaurants are used to people asking about gluten or nuts, allergies. So, asking, does this contain dairy or is there any milk, cream, or cheese in that sauce is totally normal for them. It doesn't throw them off, it's nothing strange. And if you're unsure, go with dishes that are just naturally dairy free, like grilled meat, sauteed vegetables, rice bowls, vinaigrette dressings, things like that. And if you do want to occasionally enjoy something with dairy while eating out, lactase enzyme supplements like lactate tablets can help. They won't work for everyone. Again, it depends on your tolerance level, how sensitive you are, how much lactose is in the meal, but they're a really good backup option, especially if you're in unpredictable situations like dinner parties or work lunches. Sometimes you can do the best you can to look at it at a food, determine what you think is in there, order carefully, but you can't control every detail. So it can be a good insurance policy also for people who are super sensitive. And so, like with everything, when it comes to travel, preparation is everything. I do recommend packing shelf-stable snacks that you know you tolerate, like nuts, fruit, dairy-free protein bars, or individual cartons of plant-based milk. If you're flying, double check airline meals or bring your own. And just like with restaurants, check menus online ahead of time if you can't. And once you build a system that works for you, it really does get easier. You won't have to think so much every time you leave your house, and your gut will thank you for it. So now I want to talk about when it's not just lactose, because I see this all the time in my practice, and sometimes it's not just lactose. So let's say you've eliminated milk, you're avoiding yogurt, you've even cut out cheese just in case, but you're still bloated, you're still gassy, you're still uncomfortable. I know this is many of you listening. So at that point, it's easy to assume your body is just sensitive to everything, but in reality, lactose may not be the full story. There are several underlying conditions that can either mimic lactose intolerance or make it worse. The first one is IBS, or irritable bowel syndrome. It's one of the most common gut conditions out there, and it can look almost identical to lactose intolerance. You can get bloating, gas, urgent bathroom trips, all of it overlaps symptom wise. In fact, many people who think they're lactose intolerant are actually reacting to FODMAPs, which are fermentable sugars found in all kinds of foods, not just dairy. There's another condition called SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And in SIBO, bacteria that belong in the colon end up populating the small intestine where they ferment the carbs you eat, including lactose, but there are others. And that fermentation leads to gas, bloating, and pressure. So even if you're producing plenty of lactase, your body might still struggle with dairy because of bacterial overgrowth. And another one is celiac disease, or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. This causes damage to the lining of the small intestine and can reduce your ability to produce lactase. And that's called secondary lactose intolerance. And it can be temporary. So once the gut heals, many people are able to tolerate lactose again. We do see that, and it's awesome. And finally, something that's often overlooked is histamine intolerance. Certain aged and fermented dairy products like yogurt, sour cream, and some cheeses are high in histamines. If your body doesn't break those down properly, you can experience symptoms like headaches, flushing, fatigue, and digestive discomfort. So if you've cut out lactose and you're still not feeling better, don't assume that your body's broken or that you need to necessarily eliminate all foods. It can be that something deeper is going on. And once you figure that out and address it, that can make all the difference to you tolerating foods again. So let's recap what we've covered today. Lactose intolerance is incredibly common, and while it can be frustrating, it doesn't have to be complicated. It just means your body isn't producing enough lactase to break down the natural sugar in dairy. But that often means you don't have to cut out all dairy. In fact, some foods you thought were off limits, like aged cheese, butter, and even lactose-free milk, may actually be totally fine for you. We also talked about how symptoms vary from person to person. For some, it's intense cramping and bathroom urgency. For others, it's delayed bloating or gas that shows up hours later or even the next morning. And because the symptoms aren't always immediate or obvious, it's easy to miss the connection. But the empowering part is with a little strategy and support, you can build a diet that feels good, supports your gut, and still includes foods you enjoy. Start with symptom tracking. Play around with your dairy intake, test your tolerance with lower lactose options like cheddar or Greek yogurt. Consider an enzyme supplement if you need a little backup. And if you're already doing that and you're still not feeling better, it might be time to dig deeper and explore things like IBS, SIBO, or histamine intolerance. If you're thinking, okay, this is helpful, but I need more structure, I have created a free downloadable resource that you'll definitely want to grab. It's called the Lactose Free Food Guide and 7-Day Meal Plan. It's packed with a complete list of lactose free and low lactose foods and a sample meal plan as well as grocery shopping tips. So you can download that using the link in the show notes. And if lactose is just one piece of a larger digestive puzzle for you, which is so many of you, I also invite you to join me for my free gut health masterclass. It's a deep dive into the real reasons your gut might not be healing, what's often overlooked, and how to start building a strong foundation that supports better digestion, less food reactivity, and more food freedom. You can sign up for that in the show notes. I have a link. So thanks again for tuning in today. If you learned something helpful, I'd love for you to share this episode or leave a review. It really helps others find the show. Until next time, take care of your gut